A powerful mafia boss travels to Mexico for a legitimate deal, only to be kidnapped by a ruthless cartel who mistakes him for an ordinary businessman. But as he plays a dangerous game of manipulation, his daughter launches a deadly rescue mission, until a shocking betrayal changes everything. The warm air of Cancun carried the scent of salt and distant spices as Luca Moretti stepped out of his black sedan, adjusting the cuffs of his linen shirt. He was here for business. Legitimate business for once. A real estate deal. An expansion of his empire beyond the shadows. But fate had other plans. The moment his polished loafers touched the pavement outside the restaurant, 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt. Men in masks poured out, moving with the efficiency of professionals. Luca barely had time to register the ambush before a gun pressed against his ribs. "Get in," a voice growled in Spanish. Luca raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering beneath his stoic exterior. They had no idea who they had just taken. Without resistance, he slid into the back seat of the vehicle. A bag was forced over his head, and the roar of the engine swallowed the sounds of the city. The ride was long, the air inside thick with sweat and tension. Even in the darkness of the hood, Luca could sense the nervous energy of his captors. They weren't seasoned mafia men, no. They were cartel enforcers, sloppy in their movements, overeager in their aggression. This was an opportunity. When the car finally stopped, Luca was dragged out. The fabric covering his eyes was ripped away, and the sudden exposure to light stung. Blinking rapidly, he took in his surroundings. A warehouse dimly lit with crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. His instincts sharpened. A man stepped forward. Mid-40s, lean but with the hardened look of someone who had seen too much bloodshed. Javier Ortega. Luca knew him by reputation. A brutal but reckless leader of a mid-tier cartel. A man who thrived on intimidation, but lacked the foresight of a true strategist. Ortega grinned. "You must be Moretti, the businessman." Luca didn't correct him. If Javier didn't know who he really was, that mistake would be his undoing. "You're a rich man," Ortega continued. "A man like you doesn't just walk around without protection, and yet here you are. Vulnerable." He gestured to one of his men. "Call his people. Let's see how much they're willing to pay." Luca let a slow smile spread across his lips. "You assume they will pay," he said, his voice calm. "What if they don't?" Javier's grin faltered for a split second before he regained composure. "They will." Luca tilted his head slightly, as if studying a piece of art. "You seem confident, and yet I see doubt in your eyes." Javier's jaw tightened. Luca had already begun his game. He needed to plant the first seeds of uncertainty. "You talk too much for a man in chains," Ortega spat. He turned to his men. "Take him to the desert house. I don't want him near the city." Luca didn't resist as they shoved him toward another vehicle. This was his chance to observe, to study their weaknesses. He took in every face, every nervous twitch. One man hesitated before grabbing him. Another avoided eye contact. Weakness. As the car sped toward the desolate roads outside Cancun, Luca rested his head against the seat, his mind working methodically. He would learn the cracks in their organization, pit them against each other, and when the time was right, he would strike. For now, he played the role of the helpless hostage. But Javier Ortega had unknowingly set the clock ticking on his own downfall. The scorching Mexican sun beat down on the isolated desert estate, its rays bouncing off the pale, cracked walls of the compound. Luca Moretti sat on a rickety wooden chair in the corner of a dimly lit room, his hands loosely bound in front of him. His captors had been careful, too careful. That meant they were afraid. Outside, the sound of arguing voices filtered through the open window. Luca didn't need to see them to recognize the tension in their tones. There was unrest among Javier Ortega's men, a simmering hostility beneath the surface. Luca shifted his gaze around the room. Bare concrete walls, a single metal door, one narrow window too high to reach. A cot sat in the corner, stained but sturdy. The only other object in the room was a wooden crate, likely filled with ammunition or supplies. He took everything in, every weakness, every advantage. The door creaked open. Miguel Ruiz stepped inside, arms crossed. He was Ortega's right-hand man, younger but sharper. Luca had noticed how Miguel stood slightly apart from the others, his expression colder, more calculating. "You've been quiet," Miguel remarked. Luca met his gaze, unreadable. "Observing," Miguel smirked. "Smart man, but observation won't get you out of here." "That depends," Luca replied smoothly. You don't seem convinced about all this. Maybe you're wondering if Ortega made a mistake. Miguel's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Careful, he warned. You don't know who you're dealing with. Luca chuckled, leaning back slightly. Neither do you. Miguel studied him for a moment before turning to leave. Stay put, he muttered before locking the door behind him. Luca's smirk faded the moment he was alone. He had planted the first seed. Now he needed time to let it take root. Across the ocean, in the heart of Milan, Isabella Moretti tapped her manicured fingers against the edge of her desk, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey before her. Her father was never unreachable. Never. The moment he had failed to check in, she had known something was wrong. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Enrico, one of Luca's most trusted men, stepped inside. We've traced his last movements, he said. His car was found abandoned outside a restaurant in Cancun. No signs of a struggle, but... He hesitated. But what? Isabella's voice was sharp. We have reason to believe he was taken. Her grip tightened around the edge of the desk. By whom? Enrico exhaled. A local cartel, Javier Ortega's people. Isabella closed her eyes for a brief moment, then stood. Assemble the team. Get me everything we know about Ortega. Every associate, every transaction, every weakness. Enrico nodded. Understood. As he left the room, Isabella turned to the window, her reflection staring back at her. The daughter of Luca Moretti did not cower. Her father was alive, and she was going to bring him back. Luca Moretti sat with his back against the cold concrete wall, his mind working like a precision-engineered machine. He had spent enough time in this compound to understand its structure, its routines. More importantly, he had begun to understand its people, and people were always the weakest link. He had observed the way Javier Ortega ruled, with force, but not with respect. His men followed him out of fear, but fear was a fragile thing. It could be redirected. Luca watched through the narrow window as two of Ortega's men exchanged heated words near the vehicles. One of them, a thick-set man named Ramon, gestured angrily. The other, a wiry man called Esteban, clenched his fists. This was the third time in 2 days Luca had seen them argue. Cracks. The door to his room opened and Miguel Ruiz entered, his expression impassive. He carried a plate of food, setting it down with calculated indifference. You're getting special treatment, Miguel muttered. Javier wants you strong for the negotiations. Luca gave him a slow, knowing smile. And what do you want, Miguel? Miguel's jaw tightened. I want you to shut up and eat. Luca chuckled, picking up a piece of bread. You don't strike me as the obedient type, he mused. You're too smart for that. Miguel didn't respond, but his hesitation was answer enough. You've seen it, haven't you? Luca continued, voice smooth as silk. Ortega's paranoia, his recklessness, he's losing control. Miguel's gaze darkened. You think you can turn me against him? Luca leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. I don't need to. He's already done that himself. Miguel's fingers twitched before he turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. Luca smirked, another seed planted. Outside, tension was thick in the air. Javier Ortega paced near the main house, his temper flaring as he spoke to one of his lieutenants. We need that money and we need it now, he snapped. I want Moretti's people on the phone. If they don't pay, we send them a piece of it. Ramon crossed his arms. And if they refuse? This isn't some street gang we're dealing with. The Morettis don't negotiate with people like us. Javier's eyes flashed with anger. Then we make them negotiate. Nearby, Miguel watched, silent. Luca's words had nestled deep into his mind. Was Ortega really in control? Miguel had been loyal for years, but loyalty only went so far. If Javier's recklessness led them into a war they couldn't win, what then? As if sensing his thoughts, Luca's voice echoed in his memory. He's already done that himself. Far away in Italy, Isabella Moretti scanned the information laid out before her. Maps, surveillance images, a list of known cartel safe houses. Ortega wasn't careful enough. Found something, Enrico said, stepping forward. A remote estate deep in the desert. It fits the pattern. Isabella studied the image. That's where he is. She exhaled, her expression hardening. The time for patience was over. Prepare the team, she ordered. We move soon. The Moretti estate in Milan buzzed with quiet urgency. A small team of enforcers gathered in the underground war room. their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple screens displaying maps, surveillance footage, and satellite images of the Mexican desert. Isabella Moretti stood at the center, her arms crossed as she studied the information before her. She was her father's daughter, poised, calculating, and relentless. Luca Moretti had built an empire with intelligence and ruthlessness, and now it was her turn to prove she was worthy of his legacy. Enrico, one of Luca's most trusted men, placed a tablet on the table. "We've confirmed it. Ortega's compound is here, deep in the desert. Security is tight, armed guards patrolling in shifts, motion detectors at the perimeter. This won't be a quiet operation." "I don't want quiet," Isabella said, her voice steady. "I want effective." A murmur of approval passed through the room. Isabella wasn't just here to retrieve her father, she was here to send a message. No one took a Moretti without consequence. Enrico nodded. "We've secured local contacts, some former cartel members who have grievances against Ortega. They're willing to assist in exchange for protection." Isabella's lips curled slightly. "Good. Ortega's own arrogance will be his downfall." She turned to the men assembled before her. "We move in 3 days. I want every detail accounted for. When we strike, we do not fail." In the desert compound, Luca Moretti sat in his cell, the air thick with the scent of sweat and gun oil. He had spent his days observing, measuring, planting seeds of doubt where they would grow the fastest. The tension between Ortega's men was rising, and he could feel the shift in the air. Javier Ortega, for all his bravado, was a man slowly losing control. The door opened, and Miguel Ruiz entered once more, his expression unreadable. "You've been busy," Miguel said, his voice low. Luca gave a slow nod. "So have you." Miguel's fingers twitched at his side. He wasn't blind to what was happening around him. The cartel was fracturing, and Javier was too blinded by his own rage to see it. Luca leaned forward slightly. "You have a choice, Miguel. Stay loyal to a sinking ship or ensure your survival." Miguel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. Luca exhaled. It was only a matter of time now. As night fell over Milan, Isabella stepped onto the private jet that would take her to Mexico. The engines hummed softly, the city lights flickering behind her. She took one last look at the skyline before stepping inside. By the time she landed, the game would be in motion, and she intended to win. The desert air was thick with tension. Inside Javier Ortega's compound, paranoia had settled like a disease, spreading through the ranks of his cartel. Men whispered in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders, fingers twitching near their triggers. Luca Moretti had been watching it unfold like a carefully orchestrated play. He had sown the first seeds of doubt, and now they were beginning to bloom. Outside his cell, voices escalated. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Ramon's voice boomed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Esteban shot back. Luca smirked. Another crack. The two men had been at each other's throats for days. Ramon, loyal but short-tempered, had been Ortega's enforcer for years. Esteban, younger and ambitious, had been eager to rise in the ranks. The friction between them was inevitable. All they had needed was a nudge. Luca had provided it. From his window, he saw Miguel watching the argument unfold. The right-hand man remained silent, arms crossed, but Luca could tell. Miguel was evaluating, calculating. Javier Ortega burst through the courtyard, his face twisted with anger. "Enough!" His voice cut through the shouting. The men fell silent. Ortega's eyes darted between Ramon and Esteban. "You're acting like children. We have bigger problems than your egos." Ramon clenched his jaw. "Then maybe you should start acting like a leader instead of hiding behind threats." The air went still. Luca's smile deepened. Javier's hand twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he took a slow breath and turned to Miguel. "Put more men on watch. I don't trust any of them." Miguel's hesitation lasted only a second, but Luca caught it. "You sure you trust me?" Miguel asked, his voice unreadable. Ortega's face darkened. "I don't need trust. I need loyalty." Miguel nodded slowly. "Loyalty?" Luca could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Miles away, Isabella Moretti arrived in Cancun under the cover of night. She stepped out of the black SUV, the humid air clinging to her skin. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit street where her local contact waited. A lean man with sharp eyes stepped forward. His name was Diego, a former cartel lieutenant who had barely escaped Ortega's wrath years ago. Now, he wanted revenge. "Everything is in place," Diego said. "We have eyes on the compound. Security is high, but your father is alive." Isabella's gaze hardened. "How soon can we move?" Diego smirked. "Whenever you give the word." She glanced at Enrico, who gave a firm nod. She exhaled. "Then let's get ready. Ortega won't see this coming." Back at the compound, Luca sat calmly in his cell, listening as the cracks in Ortega's empire deepened. War was coming, and he was at the center of it. Javier Ortega paced inside his office, the dim yellow light casting sharp shadows on his face. His fingers drummed against the wooden desk as his mind churned. Something was wrong. The tension among his men, the unease in Miguel's eyes, and the prisoner's infuriating calm. It all pointed to something slipping through his grasp. He had underestimated Luca Moretti. Javier grabbed a whiskey bottle, pouring himself a glass with unsteady hands. He prided himself on knowing his enemies, but Moretti had been an enigma from the start. A rich businessman? Maybe. But a man who could sit in captivity without fear? That was something else entirely. A knock at the door. "Come in," he barked. Miguel entered, closing the door behind him. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his stance, something Javier didn't like. "We need to talk," Miguel said. Javier exhaled sharply. "Then talk." Miguel hesitated. "It's about Moretti." Javier's jaw clenched. "What about him?" Miguel stepped forward, voice lower now. "You keep saying he's just a businessman, but what if he's not?" Silence. Javier felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He didn't want to hear it, but the doubt was already creeping in. Miguel continued. "I made a call, quietly, to a contact in Italy." He paused, letting the words hang. "Luca Moretti isn't just a businessman, he's one of the most powerful men in the Mafia." Javier's grip on his glass tightened. "That's impossible." Miguel shook his head. "It's not." Javier turned away, staring at the wall. He had taken Moretti without knowing who he was dealing with. And now? Now he was holding a man whose empire could burn everything he had built to the ground. His hands clenched into fists. "Then we kill him. Now." Miguel didn't respond. Javier's eyes narrowed. "You have a problem with that?" Miguel's hesitation was brief, but it was there. "We need to be smart," Miguel said carefully. "If we kill him, the Mafia comes for us. If we let him go, we look weak. We need leverage." Javier exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Then what do you suggest?" Miguel's lips pressed into a thin line. "We use him. Make a deal. Get something out of this before it's too late." Javier wanted to scream, wanted to put a bullet in Moretti's head just to rid himself of this nightmare. But Miguel was right. They needed to be smart. He downed his whiskey, then slammed the glass on the table. "Fine, but if this goes sideways, it's on you." Miguel nodded, but Javier could see something shifting behind his eyes. The cracks were deepening. Far beyond the compound, Isabella Moretti crouched beside Diego, peering through binoculars at the estate in the distance. The guards were moving on schedule. The security was heavy, but not impenetrable. "We're close," Diego murmured. Isabella nodded. "We move soon, and when we do, Ortega won't know what hit him." Her grip tightened around the weapon at her side. Her father was waiting, and she was coming for him. Miguel Ruiz stood outside Luca Moretti's cell, his mind a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. The truth had settled in like a poison. Javier Ortega had made a fatal mistake. Keeping Moretti alive was a risk, but killing him would be suicide. Luca sat on the cot, calm as ever, his piercing gaze locked onto Miguel the moment he entered. "You look troubled," Luca remarked, his voice smooth. Miguel didn't respond immediately. He pulled a chair closer, sitting down across from the prisoner. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. "You were right," Miguel finally said. Luca tilted his head slightly. "About what?" Miguel exhaled. "Ortega doesn't see what's coming. He thinks he can control the situation, but the walls are closing in." Luca leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "And you?" Miguel's fingers drummed against his thigh. "I need a way out of this." Luca's smile was barely perceptible. "And you believe I can provide it?" Miguel met his gaze. "You're still breathing, which means you have people coming for you. When they do, Ortega is finished. I want to be on the right side when it happens." Luca studied him for a long moment. Miguel was sharp, calculating, willing to betray his own boss, but not out of desperation, out of survival. That made him valuable. Luca nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding." Miguel stood. "I can get you out of here." but I need something in return. Luca smirked. Of course you do. Miguel hesitated before speaking. Protection. When Ortega falls, I need a way out of this life. Luca considered his words carefully before answering. Help me, and I'll make sure you disappear. No one will come looking for you. Miguel gave a single nod. Then we move soon. Stay ready. As he left, Luca leaned back against the wall, his smirk widening. The final piece had fallen into place. Meanwhile, in a hidden safe house outside Cancun, Isabella Moretti sharpened the edges of her plan. Diego and Enrico stood beside her, scanning a layout of the compound. Security is focused on the perimeter, Diego explained. Once we breach, we'll have a small window before reinforcements arrive. Then we strike fast, Isabella said. No hesitation. Enrico glanced at her. And if your father isn't in the main house? Isabella's expression hardened. Then we tear that place apart until we find him. Diego smirked. I like the way you think. She met his gaze, unwavering. When we go in, there will be no second chances. Ortega dies. No negotiations, no loose ends. Diego nodded. Understood. As the final details were set, Isabella stepped outside, inhaling the cool night air. Her father was close. And soon, Javier Ortega would pay for his mistake. The desert air was thick with tension as the convoy of black SUVs approached Ortega's compound. Inside the lead vehicle, Isabella Moretti adjusted the tactical vest over her shoulders, her fingers tightening around the cold grip of her weapon. Diego sat beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain. We go in hard and fast. Your father's in the main building, Miguel confirmed it. The guards won't know what hit them. Isabella exhaled slowly, steadying her pulse. No mistakes, no survivors. Enrico, seated in the back, checked his rifle. Ortega's finished tonight. The vehicle slowed as they neared the perimeter. Through her earpiece, Isabella heard the soft voices of her men confirming positions. The compound was well guarded, but Ortega's forces were distracted, splintered by Luca's manipulation. That was their advantage. She gave the signal. Go! The first explosion shattered the silence. A fireball erupted near the front gate, sending guards scattering. Before they could react, gunfire ripped through the air as Isabella's team stormed inside. Inside his cell, Luca Moretti heard the explosion and smiled. Right on time. The door burst open and Miguel rushed in, a pistol in hand. Let's go! Luca stood, stretching his stiff limbs before following Miguel through the dimly lit hallway. The sounds of chaos filled the compound, shouts, gunfire, the sharp cracks of breaking glass. As they moved, a guard rounded the corner. Miguel didn't hesitate. A single shot to the chest and the man collapsed. Luca raised an eyebrow. Efficient. Miguel didn't reply. He was focused, leading Luca through the maze of corridors toward the exit. Your people are here, Miguel muttered. I hope they're as good as you think. Luca smirked. Better? Outside, Isabella moved with lethal precision. She dropped a guard with a clean shot, then pivoted, taking cover behind a stack of crates. Through the chaos, she spotted a familiar figure emerging from the main house. Luca. Their eyes met across the battlefield. Relief flickered in Isabella's gaze, but she didn't allow herself to falter. Not yet. A gunshot tore through the air, and Miguel staggered beside Luca, a fresh wound blooming in his shoulder. Ortega. The cartel leader stood near the burning wreckage of a vehicle, his face twisted in rage. He fired again, but Luca shoved Miguel aside just in time. Isabella didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired. The bullet hit Ortega in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. Luca stepped closer, staring down at the man who had underestimated him. Javier Ortega gasped for breath, blood staining the dirt beneath him. He looked up at Luca, his expression filled with a mixture of fury and disbelief. You ruined everything, he rasped. Luca knelt beside him, his voice calm. No, Javier, you did that yourself. One final shot ended it. As dawn broke over the desert, the compound was silent. Ortega's men were either dead or had fled. The Moretti forces stood victorious. Luca turned to Isabella. You did well. She exhaled, the adrenaline finally fading. I learned from the best. Enrico approached. What do we do with Miguel? Luca glanced at the injured man who stood with his hands raised in surrender. A deal's a deal, Luca said simply. Let him go. Miguel gave a single nod before walking away, disappearing into the desert. Isabella watched him for a moment, then turned back to her father. And now? Luca smiled faintly. Now we go home. The private jet soared through the sky, leaving the chaos of Mexico behind. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. Luca Moretti sat near the window, his fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid barely disturbed. Across from him, Isabella watched, her expression unreadable. They had won. Ortega was dead. The cartel had been dismantled, and yet the weight of their victory settled heavy on their shoulders. "You're quiet," Isabella finally said. Luca swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Victory isn't always sweet, figlia mia." She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. "We did what had to be done." Luca's gaze met hers. "I know, and I'm proud of you." The words meant more to her than she would admit, but she still sensed something lingering in his thoughts. "We lost people," Luca continued. "Good men, and the ones we left alive. They won't forget." She nodded, understanding the implication. A power vacuum had been created, and in their world, it wouldn't remain empty for long. "Then we prepare for what comes next," Isabella said firmly. Luca's lips curled into a small smirk, spoken like a true Moretti. Back in Mexico, Miguel Ruiz sat in a quiet bar on the outskirts of Cancun. He nursed a drink, ignoring the news reports flashing on the television above the counter. Ortega was being painted as a casualty of a gang war. No one would mourn him. Miguel had his freedom, but at what cost? He had traded one life for another, and he knew men like Luca Moretti never truly let things go. Still, he had survived, and survival was all that mattered. Milan greeted them with the cold embrace of dawn. As the jet landed, Enrico was already waiting on the tarmac, a team of men behind him. "Everything's been taken care of," he reported. "The family is secure. Business as usual." Luca stepped out first, taking in the familiar sight of his empire. Isabella followed, but as she walked beside him, she no longer felt like the same person who had left. "You'll take on more responsibility now," Luca said as they entered the waiting car. "This war wasn't just about getting me back, it was about proving you're ready." Isabella nodded. She had known this was coming. "I'm ready," she said without hesitation. Luca smiled faintly. "Good, because there's no turning back now." As the city stretched before them, the weight of their actions settled into place. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The Moretti estate in Milan stood as an unshaken fortress, its towering gates a symbol of power and resilience. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cigars and aged whiskey, a quiet hum of activity filling the halls. The war with Ortega was over, but Luca Moretti knew peace was nothing more than an illusion. Seated in his study, he reviewed the latest reports from his international contacts. Business was stabilizing, their foothold in Mexico now secured through local allies. Yet something didn't sit right. Power vacuums never lasted long, and Ortega's absence had left a gaping hole in the underworld. Someone would try to fill it. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Isabella stepped inside, dressed in a fitted black suit that reflected her growing authority. She no longer carried herself as the Mafia heir. She was becoming the ruler. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Luca leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Tell me." She placed a file on his desk. "Intelligence from our contacts in Mexico. A new cartel is moving in, organized, disciplined, and well-funded. They're calling themselves La Sombra." Luca exhaled slowly. The name wasn't familiar, but the implications were clear. "Who's leading them?" Isabella's expression darkened. "A man named Rafael Velasco, former military, rumored to have ties with corrupt officials. He's not just another thug trying to seize power. He's smart, methodical, and he has a reason to hate us." Luca raised an eyebrow. "Revenge," she nodded. "Ortega's death created an opening, and Velasco took advantage of it. But more than that, he blames us for the chaos left behind. Word is, he's looking for payback." Luca took a sip of his whiskey, letting the information settle. A new war was brewing. He had seen it too many times before. Power shifted, alliances broke, blood was spilled. The only way to survive was to strike first. "What's our position?" he asked. Isabella took a seat across from him. "Diego and our people in Mexico are holding, but there have been attacks on our supply lines. A few of our allies have already been targeted. Velasco is testing us." Luca smirked. "Then let's show him who he's dealing with." Isabella's eyes gleamed with the same fire that had once burned in Luca's own. "I was hoping you'd say that." Meanwhile, in Mexico, Rafael Velasco stood on the balcony of a high-rise overlooking Mexico City, the lights below shimmering like fallen stars. He was a man forged in war, his scars telling stories of battles fought in the shadows. A man approached from behind, a lean, well-dressed figure with a snake-like demeanor. "They know about us," the man said. Velasco didn't turn. "Good." The man hesitated. "Moretti won't sit idle." Velasco finally turned, his cold eyes locking onto his subordinate. "I don't expect him to. I expect him to fight. And when he does, we'll be ready." A slow smile spread across his lips. "I want Moretti's empire," he continued. "And I want him to watch as I take everything from him." The man nodded. "We've already started putting pressure on their people in Mexico. Soon their foothold will crumble." Velasco's fingers traced the rim of his glass. "Not enough." He set the drink down. "Send them a real message, something they won't ignore." The man hesitated before understanding dawned in his eyes. He gave a slow nod. "Consider it done." Back in Milan, Luca sat in his study when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Diego. His instincts bristled as he answered. "Talk." Diego's voice was tight. "We've been hit. 2 of our shipments taken, 3 men dead. It wasn't a random attack. They knew exactly where to strike." Luca's grip on the phone tightened. "Velasco? Who else?" Diego spat. "He's making his move." Luca was silent for a moment. Then his voice dropped to a quiet command. "I want details. Everything you know. Now." Diego exhaled. "There's more?" "He left a message." Luca's jaw tightened. "What message?" There was a pause before Diego spoke again. "They killed Enzo." A cold silence filled the room. Enzo had been one of Luca's longest-serving men, loyal to the Morettis for years. Killing him wasn't just a strike. It was a declaration of war. Luca set the phone down with eerie calm. When he looked up, Isabella was watching him, her expression unreadable. "What do we do?" she asked. Luca finished his whiskey and stood. "We end this before it begins." 2 nights later. Mexico City. Velasco's men operated with ruthless efficiency. The warehouse where they stored Moretti's stolen goods was heavily guarded, patrolled by cartel enforcers armed with military-grade weapons. They were confident, sure that no one would dare strike back so soon. They were wrong. The attack came just before midnight. Silent, surgical. Explosions tore through the facility, sending flames licking at the sky. Gunfire echoed in the night as Moretti's men stormed in, cutting down the cartel soldiers before they even had a chance to retaliate. By the time the dust settled, the warehouse was nothing but a smoldering ruin. A message had been sent. Moretti wasn't backing down. Back in Milan, Luca sat in his office, listening as reports of the successful attack came in. Velasco had been wounded but not eliminated. This was only the beginning. Isabella poured herself a drink, her movements slow and deliberate. "This won't be over quickly," she said. Luca nodded. "No, but we'll decide how it ends." She met his gaze. "Are we ready for this?" A ghost of a smirk played at Luca's lips. "We were born ready." As the city stretched before them, the truth was clear. There would be no peace, only war, and the Morettis would make sure they were the last ones standing. Power is never just about strength. It's about strategy, patience, and knowing when to strike. Luca Moretti survived not because he was the most feared man in the room, but because he understood how to control the pieces on the board. His enemies underestimated him, and that was their downfall. But what would you have done in his place? Would you have played the long game, or fought your way out from the start? Click on the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and learn more about the art of power and survival. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the way you see the world. See you in the next one.